For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that the House suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2030.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2030, a bill to direct the Secretary of the Interior to execute and carry out agreements concerning Colorado River drought contingency management and operations and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, and gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop, each will control 20 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the measure under consideration.
Without objection,
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you again. H.R. 2030 will direct the Secretary of Interior to immediately execute the drought contingency plan agreements. The drought contingency plan agreements will allow us to immediately respond to the historic drought conditions in the Colorado River Basin. These conditions pose a threat to the water supply of 40 million people and 5.5 million acres of farmland. This legislation directs the Secretary of Interior to immediately execute the drought contingency plan agreements since the actions to be undertaken are within the analysis and range of effects reviewed in existing environmental documents. These environmental documents include, number 1, the 2007 final EIS on Colorado River interim guidelines for lower basin shortages and coordinated operations for Lakes Powell and Meade. Number 2, existing ESA documents for the Colorado River Storage Project Act, initial storage unit reservoirs. Additional environmental compliance is only applicable should further federal actions be undertaken that are outside the range of effects analyzed in the previously mentioned environmental documents. Mr. Speaker, that essentially means that the drought contingency plan agreements fit within the framework of existing environmental compliance. This compliance allows the Secretary of Interior to immediately sign the drought contingency plan agreements. This immediate action is essential to preserving the water supply for millions of people in the American Southwest. Before closing, I would also like to thank the many people who worked for years to develop and finalize the DCP. In particular, I want to highlight the contributions of the Colorado River Indian tribes and the Gila River Indian community. Without their contributions, DCP simply would not be possible. I also want to thank the 7 basin states and others who worked with me and my staff to finalize DCP and enabling legislation over the past several weeks. I'm glad that we were able to work together to develop legislation that has earned broad bipartisan support here in Congress and with affected stakeholders. With that, I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Arizona reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop, is recognized.
Thank you. You know, this is a totally unique bill. What we have done is allowed the 7 affected states to get together and work out a solution and bring it to us, and then we in Congress didn't screw it up too badly. So what we have done now is, if this bill can actually go into law, have allowed for the system to build a capacity to store 60 million acre-feet of water that will help 5.5 million acres of irrigated lands, 40 million people, and can also produce over 4,000 megawatts of clean electricity. It's rare for Congress, but in this case, we respected what the states have done, and we are moving quickly to try and get this into law. And I appreciate the chairman and the 30 other members from the affected states who have joined me as part of this bill. And now I hope we can expedite this and send it over to the Senate, where we'll ask them to refrain from their usual practices and to quickly get this bill on the president's desk. I would like it because not only is this bill bipartisan, this bill is that important. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Utah reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Yeah, let me also thank the ranking member, Mr. Bishop, and his staff for helping expedite the process and for their input throughout this process. Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes for the gentlelady from California for her comments.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you, Mr. Grijalva. I also rise in very strong support of H.R. 2030, the Colorado River Drought Contingency Plan and Implementation Act. And I thank Mr. Grijalva for his leadership on this issue that is so vital to the 7 Colorado River Basin states, including Arizona, California, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming. The Colorado River Drought Contingency Plan, known as DCP, is an great achievement of collaboration, compromise, and foresight, agreed to by the 7 basin states after 2 years of negotiations. And as stated by my colleague on the other side, it is quite an important matter to the states. It reflects a realistic appraisal by water managers in the Colorado River system of increasing water scarcity with the watershed in its 19th year of drought. That's a long time, and I think this will help prevent it. Collectively, the basin states develop a practical and workable approach that provides for enhanced conservation and new management tools to address shortages on the river system. This will allow California and other water users to store water in Lake Mead for the good of the entire system and habitat, and increase conservation measures in the basin, and bank, of all things, bank excess water supplies for future use. The Drought Contingency Plan is supported by the California Department of Natural Resources, the Colorado River Board of California, California Native Tribes, and the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. This legislation will authorize the Secretary of the Interior to implement what the 7 basin states have agreed upon. The legislation protects all environmental laws and existing environmental documents that govern the river. Enactment of this authorizing legislation will not only support the interstate agreement, but will also implement Minute 323, our treaty with Mexico, to address transnational water cooperation on Colorado River. This allows Mexico to bank water in Lake Mead for the benefit of our country to prevent shortage conditions and maximize power production. We are blessed. We have a good snowpack in the Colorado River.
Seconds.
Gentlewoman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
We are blessed that we have a good snowpack in the upper Colorado River watershed this year. Legislation also provides us the opportunity to take advantage of this extra water by beginning implementation immediately of the CDP. We must also support collaborative approaches to manage our most precious water resource, water. The DCP creates increased dependability to the water uses in Southern California and the 7 basin states. I urge my colleagues to strongly support 2030, and I urge the Senate to pass this legislation immediately. Thank you.
Gentlewoman from California yields back the balance of her time. Gentleman from Arizona reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Utah is recognized.
I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Colorado, a former member of our committee and one of the original co-sponsors of this bill, Mr. Tipton.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank my colleague for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 2030, the Colorado River Drought Contingency Plan Authorization Act. Following a historic 2-decade-long drought in the Southwest, I'm glad to see an effective strategy produced after years of collaboration between the 7 states involved and the federal government. Demand for water has drastically increased over the years due to population growth, but prolonged drought has diminished water supplies. As the location of the headwaters for the river that supplies roughly 40 million people, Colorado plays an especially crucial role in the management of our most precious resource. This past winter brought much-needed snowpack to the region, but there is no certainty that this trend will continue in the coming years, and it is important to have a contingency plan in place. Ensuring the Colorado River can meet the demands of all water users who rely on its shared responsibility among all the upper and lower basin states. The Drought Contingency Plan, agreed to by the basin states, will ensure continued hydropower operations and compact compliance. And now each state must work to develop a plan for meeting the obligations of the DCP. Within the state of Colorado, it will be critical that all of the stakeholders come together to shoulder the burden of voluntary demand management programs. The West Slope cannot carry the entire load, nor can the Front Range. I'd like to thank the local and state governments who have worked on the DCP, my colleagues in the House and the Senate for recognizing the urgency of this issue. I'm proud to co-sponsor H.R. 2030, and I'd like to urge my colleagues to vote in favor of the bill. That I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Colorado yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Utah reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. O'Halloran.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to express my strong support of the Colorado River Drought Contingency Plan. In Arizona and across the Southwest, communities have struggled through a 19-year-long drought. During my time in the state legislature, I spent years working with Republicans and Democrats alike to create Arizona's first conservation, drought, and statewide water management plans. I cannot understand how hard Arizona has worked to implement a drought program that ensures our state continues to have access to the Colorado River and other in-state water sources. And I am pleased to see the resulting plan was passed earlier this year. Now it is our turn. This legislation will complete the process by directing the Secretary of the Interior to enter into agreements with each of the 7 Colorado River Basin states, and it will ensure that water conservation efforts can begin quickly. The sooner we get these agreements signed, the sooner we can address the water issues across the region. I applaud the great work being done here in Washington and in the 7 states impacted by this drought contingency plan to put forward innovative solutions to protect our precious water assets. It is important to remember that we are not done. We must continue to these conservations and work together to manage our rivers in ways that allow cities to grow, ensure farmers and ranchers are successful, and keep our obligations to Native American tribes and nations. I urge a yes vote on this important legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Arizona yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Please yield 2 minutes to another former member of our committee and a longtime worker on water issues in Congress, gentleman from California, Mr. Calvert.
I thank the ranking
Gentleman
member.
from California is recognized, Mr. Calvert.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 2030, the Colorado River Drought Contingency Plan Authorization Act. The Colorado River is a critical source of water for approximately 19 million people in the Southern California region. After 19 years of drought, on the Colorado, Lake Mead is near critical levels. If no action is taken, it's estimated by 2021, Lake Mead could reach critical low elevations where the basic reservoir operations and water deliveries become impossible. We are here today because of the tremendous leadership of the 7 Colorado River Basin states, the water users throughout the basin. Traditionally, the shared water resources of the Colorado River have been managed through a consensus and collaboration, and the Drought Contingency Plan, or DCP, is no exception. Water users throughout the basin agreed to voluntary conservation measures that protect existing water rights in order to protect water supplies of Lake Powell and Lake Mead for the foreseeable future. I want to commend the bill's sponsor for working to ensure that the Salton Sea is protected under this legislation. DCP was developed with input from stakeholders throughout the basin, including water users, tribal leaders, environmental groups. California holds the senior water rights in the lower basin. In the short term, though, California may have the most water security during this historic drought, but water leaders in my region recognize the importance of protecting Lake Mead now to preserve Southern California's long-term water supply reliability. I want to extend a special thanks to Jeff Keichlinger for his tireless efforts on behalf of the Metropolitan Water District to get this historic deal across the finish line. If not for his work over the last several years, we would not be here today. I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Utah reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Stanton.
All right, thank you very much.
Arizona, Mr. Stanton is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank him for his leadership as chairman of the Natural Resources Committee and as the senior member of the Arizona delegation for your leadership on this important legislation. Mr. Speaker, the importance of the Colorado River to the west and to my state of Arizona cannot be overstated. 40 million people in 7 western states get water from the Colorado, and nearly 40% of the water used in Phoenix comes from the Colorado. We must absolutely protect it, and we must do so without delay. To prepare for the impact of the changing climate and a drier future, water users in 7 Colorado River Basin states reached agreements to voluntarily conserve water to better manage the risk of water levels falling to perilously low levels in Lakes Mead and Powell's, the 2 largest man-made reservoirs in the United States. A little over a week ago, the Natural Resources Subcommittee heard testimony from representatives of all 7 basin states on the urgency to authorize the Drought Contingency Plan as quickly as possible. This urgency was also expressed by the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation Commissioner Brenda Berman, who described the consequences of not advancing the Drought Contingency Plan. She said, quote, "This is a dangerous situation where we could be reaching critically low elevations that affect the drinking water of 40 million people, that affect 5.5 million acres that could go dry, that affect species both endangered and not endangered, that affect entire economies and recreation of the Southwest. Action is needed now," unquote. The legislation before us today is critical because it directs the Secretary of the Interior to immediately execute the agreements reached so water conservation efforts can get underway this year. This is by no means a permanent long-term solution. We all recognize that more must be done. But this legislation is an important step, and it must be advanced without delay. It is also important to note that this legislation had the strong support of a wide variety of interests across the state of Arizona, from our tribal leaders, including the Gila River Indian community and the Colorado River Indian tribes, to cities and municipalities across the state, including the city of Phoenix, industrial user-supported environmental organizations, and I urge my colleagues to join us in supporting this bill, and I yield the floor. Thank you very much.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Arizona reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself 1 minute. I would like the record to reflect that although they are not noted as original co-sponsors, Congressman Amadei, Buck, and Tipton were in fact with us supporting this bill since the very beginning, and it should be reflected as such. Due to an error in the introduction of the bill, they were initially left off H.R. 2030, but they should be original co-sponsors. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield 2 minutes to our colleague from Utah, Mr. McAdams.
Gentleman from Utah is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of H.R. 2030, the Colorado River Drought Contingency Plan. My state is one of the 4 upper division states, and Utah gets 22% of its total water supply from the Colorado River. The water is not only the lifeblood for farmers and ranchers in eastern Utah, it also supplies culinary water to the Wasatch Front, a fast-growing urban area where most of the state's residents live. Since the year 2000, the Colorado River Basin and the state of Utah have been in severe drought. We don't know whether the drought will continue or, due to climate change, may permanently alter the river as a source of water. In the meantime, demand for water continues to rise. Both Lake Powell and Lake Mead appear to be operating as designed, but both are at uncomfortably low levels. Congress must act promptly on this legislation so that the new agreement can be implemented and water conservation efforts can get underway. The Upper Basin Drought Contingency Plan is aimed at protecting the Upper Basin water supplies by keeping Lake Powell from falling below a specified critical elevation. Taking steps now to avoid that, it just makes sense and helps ensure that hydropower needs, water delivery, and protections for endangered species continue in compliance with the Colorado River Compact. I strongly support this bipartisan, collaborative measure which builds on past efforts to decrease stress on basin water supplies and let states and water users drive the decision rather than have the federal government make unilateral water delivery cutbacks. I'd like to thank Chairman Grijalva and ranking member and my Utah colleague, Rob Bishop, for bringing this legislation to the floor promptly. It has the backing of Utah's 4 House members and is supported by the state of Utah. I look forward to seeing it signed into law. Thank you, and I yield back.
Time, gentleman from Arizona. Mr. Grijalva reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Utah is recognized.
I'm pleased to recognize for 3 minutes another one from Arizona, one of the great members of this committee and this House, Mr. SCHWEIKERT, for 3 minutes.
Gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chairman, another one from Arizona? Look, I want to actually sort of echo what you've heard, and that is a certain happiness that we were all able to move this forward together. I appreciate the chairman, but I also want to be someone that adds a little bit of a caveat that we understand the work isn't done. Particularly for those of us in Arizona, and I hate to admit how old I am, but in the early 90s, I was one of those who worked on what we called our groundwater recharge district in Maricopa County. And when we had excess water, particularly from the Central Arizona Project in those years, we stored it. That, I think, actually, we look back now, 25 some years, was somewhat revolutionary, visionary. We will have to do things like that to meet our requirements that are part of this legislation. This legislation does not lay out every last step that those of us in Arizona must do. We are going to have to step up and meet our obligations. And I think that's important that we understand there's still much more work to be done. As that moves forward, I'm going to ask all of us, particularly those who are supporting this drought contingency plan, that we think creatively. Are there technologies? Are there encouragements of farming techniques, as we're doing urban construction and types of plants in our communities? We need to actually now go to the next step and think what this brings our communities for those of us, particularly those of us from the Phoenix metropolitan area that live in the desert Southwest. With that, I hope we get a resounding vote of approval a little while from now. And with that, I also hope that this is the right direction. We got to keep focused. Just because we've had a big hydrological year doesn't mean that we're not going to be back having this conversation a year or two from now. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Arizona yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Utah reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman for Arizona is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no further requests for time and would inquire of my colleague, Mr. Bishop, if there's any remaining speakers on his side.
No, just me, just I.
Gentleman from Arizona reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop, is recognized.
Look, I appreciate everyone who has spoken on behalf of this particular bill. It is a significant piece of legislation. And as Mr. SCHWEIKERT said, hopefully we'll never have to use it. Even in April of this year, the flow into Lake Powell is 133% of average. The snowpack is 138% of the 30-year average. Hopefully we will never have to implement it. But at some time, it may indeed happen. And by having this in place now provides for that future necessity if and when that negative time has to take place. And I'm proud the states came together. They've come up with a plan that's going to be successful, a solution to it, because if this thing does not pass, Utah's going to keep all the water and the rest of you can suck under. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop, yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, is recognized.
Thank you very much. As Mr. Speaker, as another one from Arizona, let me close by thanking the ranking member and also noting that 2026 is around the corner. And the work that was being done today with this the drought contingency plan is a very important door into what needs to be done in the future. The cooperation, the collaboration, and the urgency going forward. As Mr. SCHWEIKERT said, the job is not complete yet. There's much still to do. And I hope that the stakeholders and everyone involved getting the plan to this point continue to, with earnest and with purpose, continue to address the issue of water availability in the Southwest. And as our areas become more and more arid, the understanding that this is not an infinite resource we have, water, that it's a finite resource, and we need to treat it that way. I urge my colleagues to support the legislation. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Arizona yields back the balance of his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Bill H.R. 2030? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion reconsidered is laid on the table.